Good morning. Thank you for joining us both in person and online for today's important conversation, Challenging Autocracy from the Front Lines. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I direct the Latin America program here at the Wilson Center. In a new report from our center, my friend and colleague Leopoldo López, an opposition leader from Venezuela and a former political prisoner, paints a grim picture of the state of democracy in the world. There are only 34 liberal democracies left, the lowest number in more than a quarter century, and they are now home to less than 15% of the global population. There was less movement toward democracy last year in 2022 than in any year since the late 1970s. And a record 34 countries saw a significant reduction in freedom of expression in 2022. In the region that I study, Latin America and the Caribbean, it is still one of the most democratic parts of the planet, and yet the scorecard is also particularly grim. There are now 3 consolidated dictatorships in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And in many other countries in the region, civil liberties, such as the freedom of the press, are increasingly constrained, and democratic institutions are increasingly under assault. In El Salvador, citizens have lived under a state of emergency for more than a year. In Brazil, earlier this year, protesters ransacked the presidential palace, Congress, and Supreme Court building. In Guatemala, the Attorney General is impeding the peaceful transfer of power. Champions of democracy, including in Europe, are increasingly aware of the challenge of fighting the erosion of democracy. And here in this city, President Biden has often discussed the battle between democracy and autocracy, what he calls the defining challenge of our time. For the last 2 years, President Biden has hosted a summit for democracy designed to catalyze more robust international action in defense of democracy. So far, however, the forces of authoritarianism continue to gain ground. Look no further than the so-called coup belt in Africa, where in recent years armed groups have toppled civilian leaders in countries such as Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea. Worse still, the world's dictatorships, both new and old, are increasingly cooperating to undermine international democratic norms, help one another evade sanctions, and repress democratic opposition movements worldwide. In December 2021, on the eve of the first White House Summit for Democracy, the Wilson Center addressed the inadequate international response to this so-called democratic recession in a report we titled Lonely at the Barricades. 2 years later, as Leopoldo's report reminds us, the United States and its allies are still not effectively addressing this increasing challenge. Helpfully, Leopoldo's report does more than warn us of the troubling decline of democracy in the world. Rather, he offers ideas on how the United States and its partners, including in civil society, could begin to regain ground and support embattled democratic institutions and pro-democracy movements contesting for power in authoritarian states. First among his recommendations is to provide greater diplomatic and financial support to peaceful democratic opposition movements, including in exile, and to build platforms so that opposition groups could more effectively support one another. In addition to Leopoldo's fight for the return of democracy in his homeland, Venezuela, he has been committed to building a global network of pro-democracy movements and pro-democracy leaders. Today, he will discuss these recommendations in his report and then moderate a conversation on the urgent subject matter with experts and democracy advocates from Russia, Jordan, Sudan, and Myanmar. Before we begin, please permit me to thank our co-sponsors at the Wilson Center, including colleagues in my own Latin America program, our Africa program, our Asia program, our Global Europe program, our Kennan Institute, and our Middle East program. As you can tell, the center's work covers the globe, and all of our programs are deeply focused on these challenges to democratic norms and institutions and committed to strengthening international support for groups on the front lines of these struggles. Before I introduce our panelists, Leopoldo, I want to welcome you again to the center where you serve as a public policy fellow. Thank you for your work on this report and encourage everyone to download the report from our website, wilsoncenter.org, where you can read in detail these recommendations and Leopoldo's reflections on his own experiences in Venezuela and his time in exile coordinating with courageous advocates for democracy worldwide. We'll be joined online by Garry Kasparov of Russia, chairman of the Renewed Democracy Initiative and Human Rights Foundation, and in person, Khaloud Khair, founding director of Confluence Advisory, Nadia Oedat, former fellow here at the Wilson Center, now an assistant professor of history and security studies at Kansas State University, and Ziar Win, Burma technical specialist at IRI, the International Republican Institute. Let me thank all of you again, both here and online, for joining this conversation and for your commitment that we share to fighting the democratic recession and strengthening institutions that are in support of democracy. Leopoldo, bienvenido, welcome. Thank you for your partnership. Please, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thanks to the Wilson Center. Thanks to the panelists that are joining us today, in person and online. And thanks for all of you for being here. I spent 7 years between prison, house arrest, and then at the Spanish embassy, and I was able to escape Venezuela at the end of 2020. And the most frequent question I've gotten since I left Venezuela is, why is Maduro still in power? There are many ways to answer that question. Some people would argue that it's because he has a grip on the military. Others would argue that it's because of the natural resources, oil and gas. Others would even argue that it's because the opposition is not united. I believe that all of those might have some answers to the question why he's in power. But in my view, there is one reason above all, which is the support that Maduro has gotten from China, from Russia, from Iran, from Belarus, from Cuba, and from other nations. When we talk about the international community, many times we think of the free world international community. But the reality is that the largest international community is a community of autocrats that are working together, that are supporting each other to undermine democracy where it exists and to blockade the possibility of transitioning to democracy where there are autocracies. So that's why I decided to write about this and to think about in detail about the network and how it works, the ways in which autocrats are collaborating. In this paper, Challenging Autocracies from the Front Lines, in the first part, we describe these different ways in which autocrats are collaborating, financially, diplomatically, in terms of the manipulation of social media, militarily, the support of non-state armed groups, and other ways in which we have seen over and over the way this collaboration is unfolding. Just to give an example from my home country, Venezuela, last week Maduro was in China. 8 weeks ago, Lavrov from Russia was in Venezuela. And 9 weeks ago, the president of Iran was in Venezuela. And that just goes to show that this is an active engagement of autocrats that is happening not just with Venezuela, but with many other nations. Understanding that this was a problem that we are facing, we decided to talk to other democracy defenders, freedom fighters from all over the world. And it was very surprising to me to understand that this analysis, this view that we were not only facing our local autocrat, but in fact we were facing a global network of autocracy, became a common understanding of the problems that we were facing from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, to Sudan, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Belarus, and other places. So we decided to figure out ways in which we could collaborate. There is a network of autocrats. That's the first point I make in this paper. But there is no effective working alliance of democracy defenders and freedom fighters. So we decided to engage not just academically, but also actively in reaching out to many democracy defenders, freedom fighters, some of them in their countries, others like myself and many others in exile, but all of us with a common objective, which is to think about and to work towards the transition to democracy. Ben, in his introductory remarks, stated the state of democracy today. We are almost a quarter of century into the 21st century. Unfortunately, in almost 24 years of the 21st century, we have not seen effective transitions to democracy. There's been some cases that they've almost made it. Tunisia, Egypt, Bolivia, but they've gone back to autocratic practices. So the 21st century has not been a good century for democracy. In fact, what we have seen is a regression of democracy and a rise in autocracies all over the world. According to VDEM, an organization that analyzes the state of democracy in the world, 70% of the world population today is living under some sort of autocratic regime and growing. So this is something that requires the understanding of the problem and understanding that we need to do things differently in order to support the transition to democracy. I mentioned that 70% of the world's population are living under autocracy. However, global polling shows that 80% of the world's population want to be free. So it's not that people don't want to be free. It's not that people are not going to the streets protesting and finding ways to transition to democracy. In fact, the problem is that autocrats have a stronger grip to power and they have shared practices. In 2018, I was in house arrest and there were protests in Nicaragua. And we had just gone through a very intense process of protests in the streets in 2017. And I was watching how the protests in Nicaragua were unfolding, and I had this need to reach out to the Nicaraguans and to tell them what was going to happen. Not because I could foresee the future, but because I was seeing the past, the recent past in Venezuela, and how the autocrat from my country, Nicolás Maduro, was dealing with the protests. And the exact same pattern happened in Nicaragua. Selective shooting, selective repression, and in the end, getting rid of all of the opposition. In 2022, we saw how Iran took the streets after the killing of a woman because she was not wearing the hijab. And people took the streets massively. And people thought that this was going to be an opening for the transition to democracy. I remember talking to my friend Masih Alinejad from Iran back in November of last year and telling Masih, it might be you need to be ready for when the protests fade away. She said, well, we are in the middle of this process and we're going to be successful. And I even said, you need to be ready not for the protests to fade away, you need to be ready for the repression and even for the people to blame you and the others that were asking for the people and calling for the people to go to the streets. In March of this year, talking to my friend, she said, you were right. Again, it's not because I could foresee the future, but because I was seeing the past and the pattern that we were seeing in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and elsewhere. So this is a global struggle. And as Ben said, President Biden has framed that this is the main challenge of our times, the challenge between autocracy and democracy. And he's framing it, and I agree with this, in a global perspective. This is not only a regional issue that we are dealing with in Latin America or in the Middle East or in Africa. It's a global issue that requires global understanding, and primarily it requires a global solidarity from the free countries, from the governments, organizations, institutions, and the people from the free country to support these transitions to democracy. We are not asking, I want to be very clear about this, we're not asking for covert operations, we're not asking for military intervention, we are not asking the United States or Europe or any other country to do what we have to do. But what we are pointing to is that we can't do this alone. I wish I could say that we Venezuelans or Nicaraguans or Iranians could transition to democracy by themselves. But given that this is not a local issue, that is a global network that is supporting this whole to autocracy, we came to the conclusion that we also need a global understanding and also a global approach to how to support these movements. So in the paper, after presenting the problem, as I just framed it, we also present some policy recommendations. And I'm just going to mention them and then open up for our panel. The first is to build an alliance for freedom, just to reach out to the people, the movements, the leaders that are in their countries or in exile to work together. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that over the past 2 years, I have grown a great deal, not just here at the Wilson Center, but talking to people from all over the world, from South Sudan to Zimbabwe to Uganda to Belarus, Russia, Iran, and many other countries, and to find that the struggle that we are having, regardless of the many differences that we have in terms of religion, history, skin color, whatever type of differences that we might have, when we talk about the way in which we're treated, when we talk about our experiences as political prisoners, the way in which our movements have been attacked and even dismantled, the way in which surveillance and social surveillance is happening in our countries, becomes very clear to us that is the same struggle in different languages, in different continents, in different contexts, but it's the same struggle. So our first recommendation, and we're working in this with many freedom activists from around the world, is to build a freedom alliance. For over a year and a half, we've been working to build the World Liberty Congress, which is a global alliance of democracy defenders. We had our first meeting in Lithuania last year, and we will have our second meeting this year to create not a conference, but a movement, to create a space where we can learn and work together. The second recommendation is to rethink and strengthen the nonviolent action that could be one of the means to confront autocratic regimes. Every country is different, but nonviolent action has proven to be more effective than armed and violent action over the world. However, I have to say that the nonviolent premises, the nonviolent thinking and strategic approach from the 20th century needs to be rethought, because nonviolence as a way to go forward requires a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work. Third, sanctions. And I know sanctions are a controversial issue. Many people try to put the issue of sanctions in black and white, whether to apply or not to apply sanctions. However, sanctions are one of the very few tools that the free world has against autocrats. In my view, and I present this in the paper, the discussion about sanctions shouldn't be in black and white, should they be applied or not, but rather how sanctions can become more effective. I can tell you from my own personal experience, after talking and engaging with people from the Maduro regime, military, police, and others, that sanctions actually work. And sanctions, individual sanctions particularly, can have an impact in the change of behavior and in the way in which these key personnel are supporting the regime. So in that sense, rethinking sanctions and making them more effective is one of the recommendations that we're making. Fourth, and this is close to my own personal experience and now to many other friends, is the support of political prisoners. Political prisoners are not just the tragedy of individuals, but are a symptom of a system, are a symptom of autocrats. There are, according to Freedom House, more than 1 million political prisoners around the world. And I think they are short in their estimate of how many political prisoners. However, we have seen that political prisoners, I was myself for 7 years, require support. And the recommendation that I make in the paper is to focus in the support to families and relatives of political prisoners. I'm very glad that my wife, Lillian, is here with me today. And while I was in prison, she became the beacon of light, not just for me, but for the struggle of all political prisoners. And I can tell you that the best way to support a political prisoner anywhere in the world is to reach out to their families and relatives, because it's on them to support and to speak out and to advocate for the freedom of these individuals and for the larger problem of political prisoners. The fifth recommendation I make is to engage the private sector. We have seen over the past 15 years an active engagement of the private sector in something that we all think is necessary, which is climate change. However, the root cause of many of the problems that we are seeing with respect to climate change, it's also autocratic regimes. So I lay out some recommendations about the way in which the private sector can engage and can assume, not with neutrality about what type of government are in different countries, but in a proactive way to support and to promote democracy. I believe that democracy is also good for business, and I believe that supporting democratic transitions and engaging the private sector is one of the key elements. We have seen how the private sectors many times become a pillar of support to autocrats. We have seen that very clearly in the case of Nicaragua and elsewhere, but this is a pattern that it's also expanding around the world. So we believe it's important to talk to the private sector about their engagement and about the need for them not to be neutral. The sixth recommendation is to reposition and to strengthen international institutions. One of them that we believe requires strengthening in order to confront autocrats is the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is one of the very few institutions that can actually investigate and do some proactive work against dictators. In my home country, Venezuela, I was in prison in 2015. And I remember talking to my lawyer and talking about the ICC. And we reached out to the ICC and we started something that at the moment was a moonshot. Nobody thought that we could actually engage in a formal process with the ICC. More than 5 years after that, there is a formal investigation against Maduro, and the case against Maduro at the ICC has been the best supported with personal testimonies case in the ICC. 8,600 individual cases were presented to the ICC. People that were tortured, killed, mutilated, imprisoned, thrown into exile, disappeared. 8,600 personal testimonies, names, specific situations, specific violations of crimes are today sitting in the ICC and are pending an investigation against Maduro. We have seen also the proactive work of the ICC against Putin, and we have seen the effects of this. Putin decided not to go to South Africa to the summit because he knew that there could have been a risk of the international law going against him. So strengthening these institutions is something that we believe is also of great importance. The seventh policy recommendation is one that has to do with technology. There is an ongoing discussion about tech and democracy, tech and freedom. There are many people doing incredible things all over the world, developing apps in order for people to communicate effectively, to get information, and also to unlock the financial controls of dictatorships. However, we are presenting a very simple and starting point for the discussion of tech and democracy, which is to promote free and uncensored access to internet. Without this, all of the technological developments will be only theoretical. Access to internet is one of the things that I believe that the free world needs to come together in order to support billions of people in the world that today are censored or are completely isolated. And this is something that the world has the technology. We have seen it. We also saw how when there are big problems for humanity, the best brains, the best resources can come together in order to find a solution. 2019, we were in COVID, and nobody thought that the vaccine was coming soon. More than a year after that, with collaboration all over the world, the vaccine was available for the world population. I present this example because I think the same thing needs to happen with access to internet. So the entire discussion about tech and freedom, tech and democracy requires this initial step, which is access to internet and smartphones. Then the eighth recommendation, policy recommendation, is to provide, and it's linked to the prior one, to provide innovative ways to support financially these movements. We have seen over the past year, particularly all over autocratic regimes, laws being passed in order to strangle, to suffocate, and to illegalize NGOs, political movements. This is happening from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, to African countries, is the reducing of the civic space. And of course, the civic space, politically or civil society, requires support. And there is support that is being channeled to these countries, but many times they find the blockade of how to get the resources into these countries. And one of the recommendations I make is to think about the alternative use of stable coins and Bitcoin in order to get resources to the people from these countries. In our case in Venezuela, 2020, during COVID, the interim government crafted a program to support the people who were at the front lines, the nurses and the medical doctors, with a way of supporting them financially. At the time, and that is still today the case, the salary of a nurse in Venezuela is $3 per month. The salary of a medical doctor is $5 per month. So we were able to craft a program to provide direct support to 85,000 people through a stable coin directly to them. And it became, of course, a humanitarian success, but also it became a good way to send a message that people could be much better off if we transition to democracy. And finally, something that is always in the discussion about autocracy, democracy, which is the narrative, communications, fake news, disinformation, all of this that has become part of our regular discussion of what's happening in the state of the world. I don't think any country can evade the problem of fake news, of misinformation. However, if you think that that is a problem here in the US or in Europe, you should see the reality in autocratic countries, because there is no alternative to free media. So winning the narrative requires not just thinking about the concept, about what needs to be communicated, about what's the message that could engage people, could mobilize people, but also a technical it's a technical challenge of how to communicate effectively. So these are some of the recommendations that I make in this paper, Challenging Autocracies from the Front Lines. And I'm very grateful to the Wilson Center for allowing me to do this research at this great center with great people, and to reach out from the Wilson Center to many people from the academy and people who are themselves in the front lines. Today, we have a great panel to discuss the paper. I appreciate that you took the time to read the paper and to be here with us. And we will be very interested in hearing what you have to say and to go forward. This paper, in a way, is a draft. It's an ongoing work, because it's about what needs to be done to transition to democracy. For me, and I'll end with this is not only academic, this is my personal life. This is what I live for. I live, like many other Venezuelans, to see our country free. And we are optimistic. And I want to end with an optimistic note. Yes, democracy is backsliding. Yes, autocrats are working together. But also a big yes, people want to be free. And there are hundreds of thousands of women and men all over the world willing to fight the fight for freedom and democracy. Thank you very much.
Benjamin, do you want us there or here?
Yes. Well, so should we start with our panelists? Let's start with Nadia, that I see that's very proactive. So thank you for being here, Nadia.
My pleasure. I'm really excited to be here. The Wilson Center is one of my favorite intellectual homes. So thank you for inviting me again. I spent a year of research to make progress, very significant progress, on my book, essentially, about the war of ideas taking place in my region, the Middle East and North Africa. And so the subject is of great interest to me. So first of all, thank you so much for your phenomenal effort. The paper, I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't read it. I know that even though I teach on the Arabic-speaking world, I'll be assigning this paper, because a lot of the ideas are really important, as you made in your paper, these autocrats don't work alone. They enhance each other, they help each other, especially China and Russia. They have spent billions of dollars for decades now to invest in authoritarianism. And that investment is reaping fruits. That investment is showing up as autocracies around the world. That investment is showing up as basically, in a few years, 75% of all of humanity will be technologically enslaved by Chinese-made technology. So again, as you made clear in your paper, this is not a problem out there. That investment also is impacted in our democracies. Communities within our democracies are buying these lies. As an academic, when my students start to tell me that basically, essentially, we shouldn't interfere. How convenient that a whole generation is believing we shouldn't interfere and tell people how to live their lives if they want to be, autocrats. And I'm like, oh, really? So ISIS, their culture is to enslave women and children and rape them and sell them in markets. Should we also respect that? So that cultural relativism taken to such extreme This is exactly what autocrats wants us to do. Just be busy doing nothing about the atrocities taking place around the world. And this is very short-term thinking. This thinking is destabilizing for the entire globe. Look at one dictator, Putin. Millions upon millions of people's lives are destroyed because of one dictator. These dictators, as you make clear in your paper, interfere internally in our elections. They destabilize communities through illegal immigration. But what I want to suggest to you that you include one more recommendation, which is activate the creative sector, activate Hollywood, activate institutional, start prizes for short film festivals. I would love to see this paper be made into a documentary. I'd love to see this paper made into multiple, again, some creative person with a cell phone can make out of this paper a phenomenal infographic or short film that can easily be spread. As you pointed out, as you made clear, they are wanting to spread lies. They want to spread a lifestyle that deprives people of dignity. They can only remain in power by terrorism, by extremism, by the threat of violence. What we offer in democratic countries, we offer a life with dignity. We offer a space where everybody can self-actualize without the threat of violence, where there is law and order. 80% of the world population want to live that way. They are voting, a lot of them, with their feet. So truth is on our side. Human dignity is on our side. I also want to make another suggestion, which is, again, in your brilliant paper, you made clear that these regimes not only help each other, they actually sadly have the help of a lot of lobbyists, lawyers, who only care about profit. There's not a lot of universities who haven't received, even a lot of ones I went to, money from dictatorships. So, and that has a price. When a dictatorship gives money to institutions, to think tanks, that impacts the research, that impacts. So again, that's part of their investment, billions of dollars of investment for authoritarianism. So how can we change the laws internally in our democracies so that we make it harder for mercenaries who want to help regimes because they only care about paycheck to do so, because the destruction that ensues, again, impacts a lot of people. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you, Nadia. And I can tell you that your recommendation about bringing culture and to the conversation is something that we are doing, and I can go in more detail afterwards. But one of the things that we are trying to put together, that we are actually doing, is music for freedom. We've been working with Egyptians, with Cubans, with Ugandans that are musicians and have dedicated their activism to sing for freedom. And we want to expand this, and we want to engage with that sector. So let us go forward. I would like to introduce my dear friend and co-founder of the World Liberty Congress, somebody that I've learned a lot over the past years, my friend Garry Kasparov from Russia. Garry is known worldwide for being a chess master, but now he's known for the foresight he had for what was going to happen in Russia. He wrote a book called Winter is Coming, and that book, again, was picturing what was going to happen. And it's not because he could foresee the future, but he was looking at the behavior of Putin, his regime, and what was going to happen. So I'm very honored, Garry, that you're here with us. Thank you very much. Open to your comments.
Thank you very much, Leopoldo. So very happy to be at the conference, and congratulations with this report. I think it's very important that the report demonstrates that the fight for democracy cannot be limited to a country, a region, a continent. It's global. We have doctors without borders. We have journalists without borders. It's democracy without borders. And the current tragedy in Ukraine, Putin's criminal war he launched against Russian neighbor, it demonstrates that the world had to take sides. And we know, for instance, that our friends in Taiwan, they're watching these events very closely, as much as it's been watched in Beijing. and with different expectations. Many understand that the failure of Ukraine to defend herself and Putin's success may give an opening for Xi Jinping to begin an aggression against Taiwan. So I think the report presents this picture, and that's was the idea behind World Liberty Congress. The plan that Leopoldo laid before me and Marcel Inijad 2 years ago, saying that it was time for us to work together, not just occasionally, but to have an organization, to put our resources, our authority into the organization that could bring democratic forces, the activists from around the world. So one of the big issues is that the fight for democracy worldwide, and also the challenges for democracy in America and other democratic countries, it had been separated. And again, the report shows that it's global. It's the success of autocrats everywhere in the world gives new oxygen for autocrats in America or in Europe, those who are using not just rhetorics, but also laying down the plans for alterations of democracy and for drifting away America and European countries from the traditional democratic values, and those who would like to make deals with dictators rather than supporting our comrades in arms fighting for democracy worldwide. So I think this report is just, it makes a very important step towards creating this common space where we all fight together, and recognizing that success of democracy or failure of democracy anywhere in the world, it makes things worse or better for all of us. So whether it's Zimbabwe, or it's Taiwan, or it's facing Chinese aggression, or it's North Korea, or Russia, or Iran, or Venezuela. So we all, we're all in the same boat. And we should recognize it. As much as we recognize that climate change threatens the planet, the authoritarian regimes are the same threat. Actually, it's more immediate threat. And also, it's not coincidental that the greatest long-term danger for the planet comes from the regimes that have no interest a part of its own survival and expanding their own influence. So the long-term strategy, helping people today and also in the future, can be worked out and executed in the free world. And that's why, again, we have to be united. We have to fight together. And Leopoldo's phenomenal research demonstrates that there's no other way but bringing all our forces and resources in one lot, and again, not seeing a fight for democracy in any part of the world as a separate battle. It's one major war, and while we can lose some battles, we have we cannot afford to lose the war. Losing is not an option. It's our historical duty, it's our duty for future generations to preserve democracy that we inherited, and also to turn the tide that unfortunately worked in favor of authoritarian regimes, and making sure that the latest things that's happening around the globe, especially the war in Ukraine, will eventually create a new momentum for democracy to begin its triumphant travel around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you. And now, Khalud from Sudan. We have seen that Sudan entered a new stage of conflict, and we also saw how this conflict has expanded throughout the Sahel region in Africa. And maybe to the surprise of some, when we were seeing what was happening in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, we saw flags of Russia. We saw the face of Putin. We saw chantings and support for Russia. We have learned about the presence of the Wagner Group, now famously known worldwide, about their working in Africa and also in Latin America. So these are events that are not isolated from each other, that again are part of this global struggle. So thank you, Khalud, for coming. We would like to hear your comments from Sudan and also from the Africa region.
Sure, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this democratic backsliding, or this coup belt in Africa, is that is a question partly of timeframes. I think the democratic countries invest in democracy in other parts of the world per election cycle. There's no longer-term strategy, and that could shift depending on who's in office. Conversely, autocratic states have plans for decades, and they're able to undermine not just democracy, but any kind of pro-democratic action in countries on a much longer time frame, and make the kind of investments not just on a long-term basis, but also at the right time. The democratic states are failing behind massively on this. And, if you want to have an example of this, you need look no further than Sudan, which is now, as Leopoldo says, engulfed in a war. But prior to that, it had experienced a coup in 2021. And that sort of set the stage for the war that we're currently experiencing. It is at that time when the coup took place. And yes, there were signs of support for Russia, but mostly really, I think, to annoy the West more than anything else. And it worked, of course, spectacularly because these things tend to catch fire in headlines. But one of the things that we saw with the coup is actually a failure on the part of Western countries to back pro-democratic forces when the time came to it. So all this talk of values are often undercut by interests, unfortunately, and those interests don't always actually align with the interests of the West more often than not. Again, the short-term thinking leads to sort of a fix-it mentality rather than longer-term investment. So what we saw, for example, during the Trump years very clearly is an outsourcing of U.S. foreign policy on not just Sudan, but the Horn of Africa region in general to Gulf's allies, namely Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And sure, they are American allies, but they are not proponents of democracy, neither at home nor across the sea in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. So to what extent they're able to meet American interests remains to be seen. And obviously now this idea of big man politics or strong man politics as a boon for stability in the region has been absolutely obliterated by those very same strong men now caught up in a conflict that is engulfing not just Sudan, but potentially the entire Horn of Africa region. Had proper investments been made in pro-democracy forces, I don't think we would be where we are today, even if there was an element of inevitability to the clash between the two belligerents in Sudan today. So that said, Western countries, partly because of some elements of their foreign policy, some of their funding strategies, have made some investments in pro-democracy actors. So they are able to engage with those, much more, say, than other countries. Egypt, for example, has absolutely no knowledge of what the civil society space looks like in terms of pro-democracy actors in the region. Yet it plays a really large role in Sudan's politics. I think countries like the United States have far more ability to engage with change makers, pro-democracy actors, if they wish to do so credibly, than they think they do. Oftentimes the refrain I hear from Washington, similarly from Whitehall, similarly from Brussels, is actually we don't have as much power as we used to. It's more the regional actors that have a role to play. I mean, sure, but they're not going to give democratic states what they want to see, the kind of political outcomes they want to see in the region, nor are they going to do that for pro-democracy actors within Sudan. One of the things about Sudan is that you have a very robust, very independent pro-democracy movement that is not dependent on Western funding or Western guidance or Western leadership. It is entirely self-made. And that there is a gold mine of opportunity to set in place the kind of stable path towards democracy that's I think missing in other parts of the world. The opportunities just have not been taken up to support that, I think, in a way that is meaningful and long-term. So looking at the recommendations that we've seen, it's very clear that building alliances amongst peoples rather than states is very important. Autocrats focus on states, and that's why they're able to some degree, utilized multilateral organizations like the United Nations and others because of this focus on states and heads of state. Whereas if you focus on people, at the national level, you're definitely going to be able to make the kinds of engagements that will last longer potentially than a presidential term or a period of an autocrat's reign. But just briefly before I end, looking at how and why these coups have taken place. Yes, Russia has played a big role, particularly in disinformation, particularly on social media. Wagner has played a role, particularly militarily and supporting autocratic states. But, so has France. And in some cases, so has the United States. So how oftentimes looking at things from Africa, not from the West, one can't tell the difference between what is a US policy and what is a French policy and what is a Russian policy, because the effect ends to be the same. That guy that is making your life hell is being supported by one of those capitals. And oftentimes it's immaterial which capital it is. If I think democratic states want to set themselves apart, they have to do more to show the value of what democratic solidarity means. We have not seen that, I think, sufficiently so far at all. So when you look at places like Niger, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, part of this coup belt, it's very clear which countries were going to fall prey to these coups. We can also see a way for Gabon. Lots of people predicted that Gabon would also fall prey to a military coup. Similarly, there are concerns about Cameroon. And the biggest indicator is not how much support Wagner or Russia gives to these countries. It's what is the state of play domestically? How confident and how much consensus is there for these regimes in country? And if the answer is not very much, then you can bet that there are foreign actors, particularly Russia, but not only Russia, that will take advantage of that. But those countries, whether they are democratic states or not, they fail also to make democracy attractive. And therefore, it is incumbent upon democratic states to also engage with those heads of state that they support to ensure that they are meeting needs of local people. So just to say that absolutely agree on the first recommendation. I'm glad it's the first recommendation, because an alliance for freedom absolutely makes sense. An alliance for democracy absolutely makes sense at a time like this. It's a very crucial recommendation to have. I'm sorry I have to leave you soon, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Kholoud. Thank you very much. A couple of comments. The first is that you make a point about supporting democratic movements. And I think that we need to understand that not all opposition to autocrats are democratic. So one of the things that we understand is by creating a global democracy and freedom alliance, it's also vetting, who could be part of that type of alliance, because we need to adhere, we need to have compromises for very concrete values. And this is not an ideological issue. I think many times free countries try to understand what's happening globally, and I see this very clearly in the case of Latin America and in Venezuela, that the understanding goes through an ideological lens. And I think the approach should be more basic. It should be about what are the core values that we are supporting. And these core values are concrete, simple, but we need to keep them in mind. The first of them is free and fair elections. I have seen from South Sudan to Iran to Venezuela to Nicaragua how the main objective, the main hope for many, and in Burma, of course, of these movements are for free and fair elections. The second is the rule of law, to have the promotion of the rule of law as the way that societies can come together and work as a society. The third is the promotion and respect for human rights. And the fourth is a commitment to democracy. Under that umbrella, we can have movements, leaders that are from the right, from the left, from the center. So we have been very conscious about not having an ideological approach to the way in which we promote the democracy and the support for these movements. The second point you make, I think, is very interesting, which is that autocratic states are supporting states. We saw a recent reporting about a autocratic university in Tanzania. This was an article that came out a couple of weeks ago in Axios. I had the opportunity to meet with the journalist who wrote this, and she was telling me about how China invested more than $40 million in a university in Tanzania to basically promote their worldview of democracy. Yes, China promoting their worldview on democracy, which was very simple: state and party together controlling society. And of course, all of the consequences that that line of thought has in terms of having state and party being one of the same things. We have seen that in many of the countries, And we are seeing how the Chinese are putting millions of dollars to work with the states to become more and more autocratic. What we need to do on our side is to work with the democracy movements, the democracy defenders, to strengthen them. And I think you make a very good point about the consistency and the commitment of these movements that are from the countries. These are not movements, these are not hopes that are being exported. This is what people want from these countries. So supporting democracy movements is something that needs to be rethought. There are millions of dollars invested in democracy promotion, in human rights promotion. However, given what I said at the beginning, that so far the 21st century has not seen effective transitions to democracy, I believe that the entire ecosystem of organizations, from think tanks to advocacy organizations to different types of initiatives that are that have in their mission statement freedom, human rights, and democracy, we all need to rethink what actually works. We need to rethink what type of support this movement needs. There has been a lot of research on this, and a conclusion is that the most effective support that these movements can receive is training, is giving the tools, giving the capacity to articulate, to build movements in a more effective way, to communicate more effectively, to use nonviolence, to create a narrative approach to the problem that can connect with the people and mobilize the people. So again, this is about the people from these countries that are suffering the consequences of not being free. It's about supporting the people from these countries that want to be free. And it's also about listening what works, what doesn't work, and what type of support this movement needs. But again, the main point we try to make is that this is a global struggle. Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America are all connected in this global struggle, as Gary mentioned. Nadia, before we go to you, let's have Sayar from Burma. I don't know if you have a short comment.
Tiny one.
Okay.
I just want to comment on what you said about liberal democracies not investing all the time. You know, again, like as a professor seeing generations of students, they have bought at every level this anti-Westernism, which, again, we know autocrats have been paying billions to make even Westerners hate themselves. So I hear so much about, oh, we're so bad. An imperialist, Putin, has convinced, as he invades other countries, is convinced a lot of people that he is defending Russia by invading and destabilizing the world. So even internally, a lot of these lies are basically believed. And the danger of that, these people go on to work at the State Department, to go work at every level of government, believing that we should just, do nothing because that's more respectful. And there's an art to it, and they don't just support states. They actually, I cannot turn on the Arabic language TV, any channel, truly any channel, including ones that are paid for by Western money, our tax money, without hearing the Russian and Chinese narratives. Where are the people representing liberal democratic values? Why are they not even 50%? They're not even 5%, truly. Like I'm yet to I'm sure there's people defending democracy, but they don't have that platform. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia. Now we're moving to Burma. We all saw the events unfolding on Burma over the past year and a half. And we also saw the struggle of people in the streets calling for free and fair elections. Unfortunately, like it happened in Syria, what started as a non-violent movement quickly became a violent struggle and, of course, complicated things. But let's hear from Sayar. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. And I'm really honored to speak with the distinguished fellow scholar and pro-democracy activist. And regarding the Burma, as you may know that, Burmese nascent democratic transition was ended after the military coup in 2021. Then after that, the military arrested the democratically elected government leaders and brutally cracked down an armed peaceful pro-democracy protests across the country. And so I'd like to highlight three main points that how the military retained its power since then, and because this is also the challenges that the pro-democracy movement, pro-democracy activists facing right now is the first things is like the military brutally and indiscriminate crackdown, especially by the airstrike. So obviously the Burma cannot produce the jet fighter or cannot even produce the fuel. So these came from the one that Leopoldo mentioned, the autocratic network. They received recently they received the Su-30 from Russia, and they received the fuel from other autocratic like-minded regime, and so that they can continue indiscriminate airstrike against the pro-democracy, even the civilian. So to date, the military conducted more than 1,200 airstrikes across the country, and that caused more than thousands of the civilian home destroyed, and also the more than 500 civilians died. And since then, another point is that the military systematically and brutally suppressed the freedom of expression by surveillance on the social media and expose the civilian who criticized the regime, and even arbitrary arrests. And since to date, there are more than 4,000 civilian, 24,000 civilian currently under the arrest and sentence. So also, on the other hand, the military, they black out many of the resistance stronghold, pro-democratic movement stronghold area, the internet blackout. Some area even that didn't have the internet for the 6 months or years now. So, and also the weaponized the law to label the pro-democracy activists as a terrorist group or terrorism, and arbitrary arrest, and even justify their brutality and rationalize their brutality against an unarmed civilian. So this is the first thing, the military cracked down in this way. And second, the military divided the pro-democracy activists, pro-democracy movement by several ways, like playing the cat. So for example, there are, as you may know, the Burma has a lot of ethnic minorities, and some ethnic groups have armed wing. So the armed forces, so the ethnic armed forces, the military invited so-called the peace talk with some of the militia, the insignificant militia, and portrayed that this is we are going forward the peaceful settlement. But the real intention is to pressure these ethnic armed groups not to train the resistance force and not to support the resistance movement. And on the other hand, these armed group, these ethnic group are residing in mostly the border area with China and other the border area with China, so that the backed by the China. So this move is backed by the China. Mostly the China-backed militia attended and engaged with the junta right now. So, and also the election. So this is they are also all the time they are speaking out about the sham election, like that makes clearly make the public and also international audience confused, because this is not the election problem. This is the coup, and this is the brutality. We need to see that any sham election cannot resolve the problem and cannot make the accountable for their brutality. So, and the third point is that they maintain their internal cohesion by internal cohesion by engaging with like-minded authoritarian regime, the engaging with that their authoritarian regime and portraying themselves as the international legitimacy, and that encourage their rank and file and consolidate inner circle. And so this is the the general point of view, and we can see that the regime cannot do without that autocratic network, that like-minded regime. And so this is very clear. And also I like the idea that the report proposed about the establishing an alliance for freedom. That's the one that we need, because we are not facing a single regime or single the military. We are facing a group of the well-equipped and well-funded the authoritarian network, so that we also need like democratic government, pro-democracy at a worldwide, and also the institutions. We all need to have the strong network to counter that kind of the autocratic regime. And one very minor addition for the recommendation is like, if we consider for the sanction, we also should consider the individuals who are, working with the junta. For example, in Burma, the junta has a really profound advisor who are even in a United States citizen. So how can we do? United States enforce a lot of targeted sanction against the junta, but still, U.S. citizens is working with these people, this regime. So we also need to consider to make more personalized and targeted sanction. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Zaire. And I believe that last point that you're making is very, very important, which is what is the source of power for many of these autocratic regimes? The answer is not only what appears to be the power structure, what appears to be the formal structure of the state. It goes way beyond that. And we need to understand that these regimes have crafted a kleptocratic network of corruption that is being managed by enablers. And these are private citizens with companies that fly into and out from the US, that their children are here in the US or in Europe studying, and that they are the backbone of these kleptocratic networks. We have heard from all of the panelists that autocrats have many resources to push for autocracy all over the world. So one of the tools the free world has is to go after these resources, to go after the enablers, to blockade these companies, to identify these individuals, and to do targeted sanctions against them. That's why the discussion about sanctions, I believe, need to incorporate the understanding of what's actually keeping this autocratic governments, these autocratic regimes with access to plenty of funds. They have absolutely no transparency in the management of these funds, but we do know that this information is available. We do know that the tools to go after these funds, these companies, these individuals is out there. It's a matter of the will to do it, of political will. And I think that this political will is not only a responsibility of the policymakers, but also of the public opinion. And I want to make a point about why this entire discussion is important to the people from the United States and from Europe and from the free world. Because it could be very easy that somebody listens to all of us from Sudan, from Jordan, from Burma, from Venezuela, from Russia, and think, well, that's their problem. Let them deal with it. Let them figure it out. We want to remain isolated. We want to remain independent. And as you very well said, Nadia, that there is a narrative that is growing from universities, from the public media, to present the idea that supporting these movements is some sort of interference. And I think the framing of this needs to start from what are the values that we are supporting? What do we believe to be universal values? If we believe that democracy, human rights, freedom are universal values, that free and fair elections is something that any society in the world should have access to, or we need to understand that there needs to be a support to promote these transitions to democracy. And for the US public, it's very important to understand that an inch lost to autocracy outside to the borders of the US, it's an inch closer to autocracy here in the United States and in every country. So this is an issue that does have an impact, that does have consequences even for the people who were born and raised in a free country. For us, talking about freedom, talking about human rights, it's not a theoretical discussion like it is for many people who have been born and raised in a free society, because it's what you've been accustomed to. It's the day-to-day. For us, talking about freedom and democracy, it's about the struggle of our own individual lives, the lives of our families, the lives of the people we know, the way in which they have been taking away these freedoms. And I truly believe that these are universal values. And I believe that these are universal values worth struggling for, worth fighting for. And I also believe, as I've said many times, and it's the core of the paper, that this needs to be a global struggle. So I am optimistic. I think that there are many reasons to frame the current situation from a pessimistic perspective. But the reason why I'm optimistic is because I've gotten to learn from hundreds of people all over the world who have the will to fight for freedom. And that will to fight should not die. That will to fight should be supported in many ways possible, because if we don't do that, we will see the consequences outside the free countries and also the consequences inside. Nadia.
One activist is reputed to have said that the social media enabled the Arab Spring, but right now, because of social media, there will never be democracy. And what that says is that we really need to basically clean up the internet. It is now flooded with autocratic, authoritarian messaging. This is the most creative, the free world is the most creative space on earth. There's nowhere else where there's so much creativity, so much goodwill, and that creativity needs to be basically channeled to clean the internet and truly allow for pro-human rights, pro-universal values to have a space on the internet. Because right now, if you're an activist, if I was to tweet one thing, I could be flooded with autocratic bots, whether it's from Russia, authoritarian regimes around the world, and that cannot be the case. We need to clean up the internet.
Thank you. Gary.
I'm not sure that you can ban some people attending chats and participating. But following what Leopoldo said, it's about money. It's about resources. Follow the money. Cut their access to the funds, and they will have not money to pay for troll factories and for bots. Unfortunately, we have to admit, the free world has very little appetite to go after money of autocrats. And even in the cases like with Ukraine, where you have a clear moral case, genocide, war of aggression, we still see so many hesitations. Yes, how will it affect the global financial stability? There are many excuses for doing nothing. And as long as autocrats have money, doesn't matter what we do, they will be always 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of us. So it's very important that there will be a plan how to advance democracy by forcing them to play by the rules, because there's so many occasions where they violated the international rules, and they had to be these cases must be used to go after their money, make sure that the sanctions work, and all their violations of human rights and international order will have an immediate and effective response. Again, it's a part of the strategy of the free world, as we had during the Cold War, and we are facing something similar to the Cold War. It's a new one because there's no iron curtain. The world is interdependent. There's connection. Whatever happens in Indonesia or in Bolivia, we can find out in a minute, maybe even within seconds. But again, it's unless we have a strategy how to use the advantage of the free world, it will be, as Nadia said, will work to the advantage of our opponents. Again, So I think the report indicated strategy is needed, but the strategy had to be agreed upon by the free world, especially by the United States as a leader of the free world. And we, again, while being part of international institutions, we should not pretend that these institutions, like United Nations, can solve our problems. Russia is now trying to come back to the UN Human Rights Council. And most likely it will, because there are so many countries that are the worst violators of human rights, and they are forming core institutions of the United Nations. Again, the free world must come up with the thoughtful strategy, how to create institutions and global alliances that will share the same values, not just paying a lip service to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I've had the opportunity to speak to hundreds of leaders and activists from all over the world, autocratic regimes. I've yet to find one person from the front lines in the struggle for freedom and democracy that does not agree with the imposition of targeted sanctions. And I think these are voices that are important to be heard, where sanctions could be crafted and implemented. I think that these are the voices of the people that are suffering the consequences of autocratic regimes that need to be heard, because there are millions of dollars that are being channeled to lobbying efforts in many ways to present the narrative that the problem of these countries is because of sanctions. I don't think that sanctions by themselves are a solution to the problem, but what we are advocating for is to rethink the effectiveness of sanctions, to rethink the way in which they can target the people, the companies that are enabling these autocratic regimes. And with your comment about the social media, I think it was very graphic to your point when we learned that the head of the Wagner Group was not only leading a militia of mercenaries, but he was also, and the Wagner Group was also managing a massive factory of trolls and bots that was targeted not only to Russian population, but to the worldwide population. Why is this very important? Well, this is the Wagner Group, a group of mercenaries supported by Putin and his regime. They were doing two things. They had people with machine guns going to countries and controlling different criminal networks and organized crime, but they were also playing in the battlefield of narrative and communication, the same organization. So I think that this points out to the type of challenges that we have. There are millions of dollars put into these types of technologies to intoxicate the conversation, to intoxicate the way in which we understand what are the priorities. And I want to remind an example that happened right here in this room. A couple of months ago, Juan Guaidó from Venezuela was here and he was giving a speech. And some representatives from an organization called Code Pink, they stood in this very same room and they started to attack Juan Guaidó and what he was saying. Well, months after that, we learned from a New York Times article that that organization, Code Pink, is fully financed by China. So what we had here were not Americans, or they may be Americans by birth, but they were representing the interest and the mandate of the Chinese. And again, you can look to the newspaper, the New York Times article that presented how this is one of the many NGOs that are here in the United States that are financed by Chinese money and that are targeting the people who are defending the very same core values that have made this country a great country. So we need to understand, we need to look behind. So it's very easy for the non-educated witness to this type of events that take place to think, well, you know, there are some people supporting the Maduro regime. Maduro must not be that bad. Well, the thing is, we had an organization financed by the Chinese supporting Maduro. So that's another example that happened right here in this room of the way in which this network works. And this is happening all over, and it's happening every day, and it's happening in US soil, in European soil, and of course it's happening in our countries.
You know, I think the war, I mean, the very first step is to take on that war of narratives, that war of ideas. I mean, I know there's been a lot of lip service to winning hearts and minds, but I don't actually believe, as a researcher who's writing a book on the war of ideas, I don't believe we have really took on this challenge, truly decided to take it on, as we did with the Cold War. And right now, as I see it, for example, in the Arabic-speaking world, again, our side of the narrative is not there. If you are on the side of democracy, human rights, what you hear pretty much 24/7, there's no independent, hardly any independent media in the Arab world. Pretty much every single media is government-owned by autocrats, essentially. Again, even the ones that are supported with Western tax money, they are being, because there's not an awareness. There's a war of ideas, there's narratives. If somebody goes online to say every problem on earth is because of the West, is because of colonialism, as if nobody else had a colonial history, as if everybody else was a pacifist and they were living by optimal human rights until the West came about, which is such a lie. So the war of narratives is the most important pillar, in my opinion. Before we go to actions, we need to win the war of ideas.
Absolutely. So we're heading to the close, and I would like to open for some questions from the audience. Yes, Cynthia. Hello, how are you?
Thanks so much for this really stimulating panel. I'm Cindy Arnson. I'm a distinguished fellow here at the Wilson Center. Leopoldo, I'd like to ask you about one of the points, one of the recommendations that you make in the report about the ICC. And it has to do with the fundamental tension between accountability and transitions. And it comes up in transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. It comes up in transitions from armed conflict to peace. How you treat human rights violations in the past. And the truth is, if you offer an autocrat that he or she resign and go to jail, that person is going to cling to power. So how do you inject a sense of pragmatism into the completely ethical and moral demand that people who have committed atrocities should face accountability? How do you do that other than offering someone a jail cell in The Hague or in a supermax in the United States or somewhere else? Thanks.
No, it's not an easy question, but I think that impunity and a blind eye to violations of human rights should not be the answer for a hopeful, eventual, not clear negotiation process or transition to democracy. I do know for a fact from my country that one of the reasons why Maduro would be engaging or would be interested in engaging a negotiation that has been going on for 20 years now in different ways with different people, with different mediators, is the fact that he's been pressured by sanctions and by the ICC. What can happen with that investigation? Well, I hope that the people who are responsible for violating human rights and torturing, killing people, some of them that I know, my friends that have been buried because of their struggle for democracy and freedom in Venezuela, that the regime is accountable. And I want to give you an anecdote. I was in prison, in a military prison in Venezuela, and I remember telling the director of the prison and my guards all of the time, I said, you are violating my human rights. You are committing crimes against humanity. And they would laugh at me. And they would say, I am completely anonymous. Nobody knows who I am. And I'm only following orders. And I said, yes, you're following orders, but you're executing them. And you are responsible. And that was back in 2015, 2016. And I told them, we will do whatever we can do in order for these violations of human rights to be accounted for. And now with the ICC, we have seen that at least they understand, the people who are executing the orders to violate human rights, that they can be accountable. So can this be a deterrence for actions? I believe so. Is there an easy answer to how we deal with accountability and justice for the future? No, there is not. But I think that strengthening these international institutions to present the crimes that have been committed is very important. For us in Venezuela, for example, there has been a narrative that floated over the past year and a half that Venezuela fixed itself, that things are getting better in Venezuela. And that has been a narrative pushed by many lobbyists, by, of course, the regime that is interested in presenting this. But the fact that the UN and the ICC have consistently shown that there continues to be violations of human rights, well, presents the true face of the autocrat that we are facing in Venezuela. None of these challenges are easy, but I truly believe that without pressure, that without the companionship, without the support of the free world, it would be very, very difficult to transition to democracy. I know it's a very, it could be a very attractive narrative to say, well, let the people from Venezuela, from Cuba, from Burma, from Sudan deal with their issues. Well, we have heard from today, but it's greatly reported of how these autocrats are not by themselves, but they are part of a global network. So no easy answers, but we do need to strengthen these institutions to bring about to the face of the people from the countries and to the world the true face and actions of these autocrats. Gary has a question.
Oh, no, it's not a question. I want to add to what you just said. So it's for instance, everybody talks about Vladimir Putin being indicted by ICC, International Criminal Court. But very little is being said about the second person, Maria Lvova-Belova, the so-called, she's in charge of the child's policy in Russia, and she was, indicted because she executed the crimes ordered by Putin. And I think if we can put pressure on these kind of people, those who are in charge of execution, we have a chance of making them think twice before doing that. Putin, Maduro, God knows what happens with them. They're big guys, maybe they cut a deal, but they should know that every regime that will follow the current one will send them to Hague. As long as they understand that the Hague is inevitable, we have a much better chance of them, if not totally rejecting the order, but sabotaging them. I think that's the key, at least few examples like this woman who were clearly involved in crimes against humanity. They should be, these cases should be emphasized, they should be publicized, and everybody should know that Hague is inevitable. And then, again, we can, if not eliminate these crimes, but definitely to make those responsible for execution thinking twice or thrice before following the order of the big boss.
Thank you, Gary. So we are heading to a close, but we want to open up for other questions.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Juan Lorenzo Holman. I'm Nicaraguan. I was a political prisoner. Now I'm a stateless person, thanks to Daniel Ortega. On your 9 points, sanctions, yes, they are important, but not just to put the sanctions. They have to follow the sanctions, and that's one of the problems that we are facing with regarding sanctions. Why? Because they put the sanction to Pedro, and then Pedro moves his money somewhere else, and that's it. The sanction stops. So I think that we've been talking about following the money. Mr. Kasparov said follow the money, and follow the money all the way. All the way. So it's not putting more sanctions. It's working on the sanctions that are already in place. On your 9 points, I feel that you didn't, is something that I felt that for example, independent media is not shown directly, and independent media is the most important part of an equation, because independent media is the voice of the society. So if with the strong independent media, you fight misinformation and you fight fake news and all that. All important researches and are done by independent media. You mentioned the New York Times, you mentioned the Washington Post, yes, and in Nicaragua, La Prensa, in Venezuela, there are many independent media that point out what the regimes are doing. So I think that that should be included. And now, how do we fight against people or regimes that don't have any values, that don't have any core values, or against their brutality, like you were saying? We are trying to handle this situation with silk gloves with people that need strong fight against. I mean, so it's a question on how do we fight against people that are not how do you say it, morally strong or whatever. Yeah. So.
No, thank you, Juan Lorenzo, and thanks for being here. And we understand very well what Nicaragua is going through, and we look ourselves in the mirror every time we see what's happening in Nicaragua. So for sure, in the 9th point, winning the narrative, one of the issues that we talk about is independent media. And this is a general paper, and of course, each one of these issues can go into much more specific recommendations. So just, we've been talking about sanctions, and I think that there is no clear answer to that. But I think what is clear is that sanctions need to be rethought, and that sanctions require a lot more strategic thinking, and also thinking along the lines of what you're saying, implementation, because many sanctions fall in the cracks of implementation issues. So they are imposed, but then, as you very well say, they are not followed through. And many times this is because of lack of resources, understaffing, and political will, or maybe the mixture of the three. So what we should advocate for is a rethinking of how sanctions can become a more effective tool. So thank you very much. I know we had another question here. Yes?
My name is Renata. I'm here, a fellow at the Wilson Center from Brazil. I literally just arrived, but before in Brazil, I used to coordinate our civic space program, and so many of the things that we just heard here, we can see everywhere. And I know the situation in Brazil is very different from what you are all confronting elsewhere in the world. But I do want to go back to the war of ideas and some of the points that colleague from Nicaragua just mentioned on the role of fake news, because we see that there are many common trends, the role of the military, the shrinking of the civic space, attacks to rights, but fake news. And you mentioned, Leopoldo, that 80% of the people want to be free, but into 2019 in Brazil, 82% had wanted military rule because they were convinced that was the best. People do not necessarily understand the relationship between autocrats and free and the lack of freedom and what they're missing with that. And so I think, I wanted to ask you if you have ongoing conversations with social media platforms and things like that, because I think they are a giant problem and they are really helping undermine democratic values. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And your question leads me to make a comment about the global discussion about democracy. So just to make it kind of simplify, I believe that there are three conversations that can take place when you talk about democracy globally. The first is the state of democracy in places like the United States, Europe, and functioning democracies that are going through great strain. I mean, this country is going through great strains in terms of its democracy, and likewise, many other democratic countries that we hold as the strongest democracies around the world. So that's one type of conversation. Then you have another type of conversation that are the countries that are sliding towards autocracy from being a democracy. And that's the case of Venezuela. Chavez won the election, and then from within, he destroyed democracy. He started the destruction of democracy very early on with a constituent assembly that drafted a new constitution with new institutions. He packed the institutions with people who were close to him, and over time, democracy was killed. And now it's very clear to everybody that Venezuela is far from being a democracy, and we're clearly and autocracy. And the third conversation is the one about the countries, the majority of the countries in the world, and the majority of the population being exposed to this, which is what do we do to transition to democracy? Very different types of conversations. I have focused in this paper in the third group, in the group of countries, of societies that are not free and that are struggling for democracy. And it's a very different challenge than the one we have in a functioning democracy. Given that you're from Brazil, I want to make some comments about the enablers, because there are different enablers that are supporting autocrats. There are, of course, the corporate, the business, the kleptocratic and corrupt enablers, but there are also the political enablers. And I believe that, unfortunately, in Latin America, we are seeing a growing narrative to support autocratic regimes. And I'll give you some examples. There was the Summit of the Americas last year, and countries from all over the region boycotted the summit, starting from Mexico to the Caribbean countries, Argentina and others, because the US decided, rightly so in my view, not to invite the violators and corrupt and autocrats from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. I have heard from Lula that the problem of Venezuela is one of narrative. And when you are a Venezuelan, and you know what we've gone through, and you know that people are dying because they don't have food, or people are dying because they don't have access to medicine or to a healthcare system, to hear from another president of the region that the problem of Venezuela is one of narrative and it's not about the destruction of our country, of course, it puts us in a position to clearly understand that these are democratic leaders, democratically elected, that are enabling these autocratic regimes. And I'll mention another one. Right before the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, Alberto Fernandez from Argentina, he met with Putin and he said, the doors to South America will be open to you and to Russia from Argentina. So very clearly, again, these are enablers that are coming from democratic countries. And I know this puts another layer of complexity to what we are dealing with, but our responsibility is to hold tight to our objectives of transitioning to democracy and to identify all of those positions that are looking to stabilize the dictatorships. And along those lines, I think that we need to make the comment about the different priorities in policy. I understand that the main priority of the US towards Latin America at this moment, because it has a great internal impact, is the issue of migration. And I have heard some people say and claim and think that the right policy for the US in order to contain migration is to stabilize the dictatorship, to give the dictatorship of Venezuela legitimacy, funds, resources, and stability, and that will contain migration. Well, my answer to that is go to Cucuta or go to Texas or go to anywhere where there is a Venezuelan that has walked for weeks leaving our country and ask them, what will it take for you to go back to Venezuela? And the same would play for many other countries. And you will find the same answer over and over when there is political change. People get it. People get it. People know that the root cause of the problem is the autocracy, that the root cause is not the sanctions, that the root cause is not a mismanaged economy, that that all of the above may be part of the issue, but the root cause, the core of the problem, starts with the autocratic regime and the consequences that it has on billions of people around the world. I know that we are running short of time, but I ask you, Ben, if we can have two very short questions, and I'll ask right here, and one from Sudan, one from Venezuela, and I'll make sure that to be very short in the answer.
Thank you, Leopoldo. Congratulations on the report. I think it's very important for anyone in the world facing autocracies to read this report, and thanks for all the panelists that are joined today. You just pointed out, I wanted to say that on migration is very important. If we sum up people who have fled Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Burma, there are approximately 25 million people. That's the size of whole Australia. And that is not because of sanctions, that's not because of violence, that's because of autocracies. And if we include Ukraine, that has been invaded from a autocracy system, autocratic regime. So it's more than 30 million people who have fled because of that. So and those regimes are using the migration outflow also to have more impact on the region. So I think this is a very important issue. There's a lot of discussion now in the Hill about if the Venezuelans are fleeing because of sanctions or not. And I can assure you that no migrant will say to you here in Eagle Pass or wherever they're getting that they have fled because of sanctions. And also, I'm sorry, on the recommendation, I think what you said about the private sector is very important because what I'm concerned, and I would like to know, what do you think? It's that many of the most important corporations in the world were born in a country that guarantee freedom and guarantee economic liberties. And then they started to do business on those autocratic countries, more specifically, for example, China, and they don't play a role there. And if they do money, they're fine. And I think now in a globalized world, I think the private sector has should be more proactive tackling autocracy. So how do you see that specifically from not only tech companies, but other important corporations? Thank you, and congratulations again.
Thank you very much. Let's go to your question.
I'll be very quick, yes. Thank you, Leopoldo. Really excellent paper and excellent panel. My name is Samah Salman. I'm from Sudan. I wear private sector hats, so thank you so much for that finding on the private sector. I also come from civil society. My question is there. Recently, we were in a talk with Dr. Munsif Marzouki, the first democratically elected president in Tunisia after the revolution. We had 3 glorious revolutions, one in Sudan, one in Tunisia, and one in Egypt. And unfortunately, these 3 countries are all now under military dictatorship once again, huge backsliding. So my question is this, in your paper, you talk about, so I agree with you on all of the external factors, absolutely. Internally, opposition movements and their tendency to coalesce in a really united front at the time of a revolution, but then have a tendency to disintegrate and to repolarize and around divisions in ideology. I really would like to get your thoughts quickly, and those on the panel, of how do we keep opposition movements united even after that external enemy is eliminated? Thank you.
Yes, we're really running out of time, but first with David, your comment on the private sector. Recently, I had a conversation with a company that is investing now in Venezuela in the energy sector, and they were telling me about all of the benefits of having private funding for the oil and gas business. And they went on and on about why the private sector would be very important for the oil and gas industry. And I was very clear to them. I said, listen, I'm not an expert. I did work in PDVSA for some years. I wrote a book about energy policy, and it's all about the importance of the private sector in the oil and gas industry. I truly believe that we need the private sector for the oil and gas. But I ended my comment by telling them, for us, the priority is not profits. The priority is freedom. So if your profit goes against our freedom, there is no way we can ever support what you're doing. However, if your profit supporting the path to freedom and democracy in our country, we will be and stand behind everything that needs to be done. So investment, the private sector are not neutral. They do have positions and they do have an impact. And with the question about opposition, just a very, very brief comment. This is something that I've gotten to learn. I don't know of any democracy movement in an autocratic regime that is completely cohesive, that is completely united, that they all work together. I have heard from many, many activists all around the world that this is something that they struggle with, and that many believe that this is an issue of their own countries. So when they talk about this issue, they talk about this issue with some weight, with some shame, kind of saying, well, I feel bad, maybe we are not doing the right thing. Well, in my view, it cannot be that Russians, Belarusians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Sudanese, Zimbabweans, Ugandans are all bad people, are incapable. The reality is that this is part of the strategic approach from the autocrats to permanently divide the opposition. Can we do something about it? Yes, we can. I'll just give you an example. 2 weeks ago, we had an event where we gathered more than 100 activists from Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And what we did, we invited representatives from all of the opposition groups of each one of those countries. So the training that we had, the discussions that we had, also had a positive externality that was creating this space for the different opposition movements to come together and to think in a common and collective way about their challenges. So now time has run out. I really want to thank the Wilson Center. Ben, thank you very much. And thanks for all of you for being here. Thank you very much.